Access 2007 was a dramatic change from the earlier versions where the database window and the menu structure went away and the tabbed Fluent interface, the navigation pane, and the shutter bar were introduced, as well as some significant changes to the way forms and reports are designed. This, of course, paved the way for quick object creation, even for anyone with minimal knowledge of relational databases. For example, when I create my first database and open it, I'm immediately greeted by a table. I don't have to know anything about table structure, design, or relational databases in order to start using this and adding records. I do have some issues with that, and we'll talk about that in just a second. I also know that I have the ability here to create tables by going to the Create tab and saying that I want to create a table or Table in Design View. And there are a variety of other options too. For now, let me go back home. The ease with which people can get started with Access was touted as a benefit of Access 2007. While I understand that argument, as an old-school Access developer and as an instructor, I have some issues with people being able to work in a relational database without really knowing what they're doing or what's happening behind the scenes. Regardless of that, it did open access to many who otherwise probably wouldn't have been able to use it. Adding fields was not difficult. I could start adding data here. I could work with some of the other features, or, of course, I could go into Design View after saving the table. And from the Design View, I could type in field names, work with the data types, the descriptions, and the other properties necessary to create a good quality relational database table. Believe it or not, though, in Office, they've made this even simpler. I'll right-click on Table tab and close this, and now I'll show you something new that we can do. If I go back to the Create tab, before we were looking at tables and table design, take a look at the far left edge. There's something here called Templates and an option called Application Parts. Application Parts are new. They allow us to create things as groups, if you will, from a variety of templates. This will extend the functionality and make it very easy and very fast for us to create wonderful applications using Access. I'll open the gallery and you can see that there are a couple of parts. The first talks about blank forms, and then down below it has something called Quick Start. An application part can be as simple as a single table or group of fields. It can also include several database objects, as well as tables, forms, reports, and even relationships. You can actually save an entire database system here. The Application Parts Gallery lets you see all of these things and then use the parts as you need. Some of them, like the basic forms at the top, are actually form definitions that you can use to make your form creation easier. Here you see some common types of forms, including things like dialog boxes and message boxes. By creating these from application parts, you'll save a lot of time having to configure the unique properties of forms used in these capacities, which you would have to do if you created them from scratch. Other parts, like contracts, for example, are more complex and can contain tables, queries, forms, reports, macros, and even modules. Before getting too carried away thinking about the extent to which we can use this, let's focus on just one use. Right now, I want to create a database for tracking contacts that will primarily be our students for the You Got It training company. To speed up our development, I'll use the Contacts Application part to give us a huge jump start on our database development. I'll click on it, and it may take a few seconds for it to pull up the template. Then it will ask me, because I already have one table, Table 1, that I didn't really do anything with, if I want to create any relationships with that. So, once again, you don't have to know how to go in and actually create a relationship in Access. It will walk you through the step. If you don't know what you're doing, the default option will usually work. In other words, it says 1, Table 1, to many contacts. And if you've used Access, you know that a one-to-many relationship is the most common type of relationship. If you know a little more, You can create a one-to-many the other way, or you can simply say there is no relationship. Since I only created that first table as part of the database, as an example, I'll say there is no relationship between these two tables. Then I'll move to the bottom right and click Create. Because this template comes off the internet, I need to click the Enable Content option from the Security Warnings bar at the top of the screen. And now you'll see our newly formed objects in the navigation pane. I was actually able to create an entire database with just a few clicks. Even though many objects were created, all I need to do for now is open the Contacts table. This is where we'll be working for a while. I simply double-click to open it. There we go. So I actually created a complete table by doing a couple of clicks. You'll see that it has ID, company, last name, first name, email address, and several other fields that you would want to track as part of a contacts table. This will give me consistency, not to mention how fast it was to do this without having to go through the design view to put in all of the field names and set all of the data types. Naturally, once this is created off of the template, it's as if I created it from scratch. I can go into the design view by right-clicking on the tab. I'll right-click Design View, and then I can modify anything that I want. For example, if this is supposed to be a student's table, I might change ID to Student ID. And auto number is just fine, and of course I can come down and continue working. You'll also notice that the field names are a little better than before. The actual field name is the last name with no space. If I look at the bottom of my screen for the properties, I see that the caption has been filled out for last space name. If you work in Access, you know that the challenge has always been that although Access, Microsoft, and Windows allow spaces in field names, it's not a good idea. It's just one of those best practices. So in this version, you'll see that our field names are good, but they put in the caption properties as well, and that will keep everybody happy, including the computer system. Table design is really one of the simplest things you can do in Access, but it also one of the most critical because it provides the foundation for everything else that you'll do in the database. So we need to work with the field names and properties, but we also need to work with the data types. For the most part, the data types haven't changed much, with one exception. I'll scroll to the bottom of our fields. Now remember, these were created by using our parts. And as I scroll down, you'll see two fields with the new field type. It's called Calculated. A calculated data type is actually a little bit difficult for people like me, who have been using Access since the DOS days of Access 2.0. For me, calculated fields don't belong in tables. They belong in queries or forms or reports, but not in tables. And now, guess what? Here we have a calculated field. It goes against some of the normalization rules that you may be familiar with. But I'll admit that I have to give credit to Microsoft for figuring out how to accommodate what real people need, not just what is good in pure database theory. So it's not that straightforward. Let's take a look and see what this is actually doing. So when we work with this calculated data type, it's selected from the drop-down. It's added in like everything else has been, and you'll see that calculated is one of our options. If I go to our properties, you can actually see that this is an expression. I'll click in the expression property at the bottom of the screen and then press Shift F2 to bring up the zoom box so you can see the whole thing. In short, this is a combination of intermediate if statements as well as some concatenation. Instead of going through all of it, which you may not be ready to use, I'll show you how it actually works when you work with it in the table or the data sheet itself. So I click on Cancel, get rid of that, and move over to Data Sheet View. I'll save the table because it thinks I made some changes, which I did to my field names. Now I can start entering some records, but I'm not going to enter complete records. The last name field is required, so I have to have that, but I'll do some different combinations of things, and then some different name combinations. Since I know that I have to have a last name, I'll make sure to put that in. But I won't put in the company this time. And this time I'll put in just the last name. And how about one more combination? A last name and a company, but no first name. Something like that. Now, why do we care about all of this? Well, I'll move up to my first record and press the End key to move to the right side of the table, because I want to show you how I get the concatenation or the calculated field. In the first one, I put in Aaron Olson, and you can see that there are actually two fields that are calculated, one called the contact name and one called File As. The first one has both pieces of information, Aaron Olson from You Got It. So the contact name is Aaron Olson, and it's filed as Olson, Aaron. So far so good. Basically the same thing is true when we have a name without a company. File name and the contact name are the same. If, on the other hand, I have limited information, it will use the last name as the contact, and then file it as the last name as well. And then lastly, if there isn't a company name at all, everything will still work. Why is this important? In the past, we got creative when we entered information, just to make things work. For example, for a mailing label, if I wanted to show an individual's name and their company name, everything was good as long as everyone actually was from a company. But if they were an individual or self-employed and didn't have a company name, I'd run into some challenges. In those cases, people would often retype the first and last name into the company field so that it wasn't blank. Sometimes this worked, other times it didn't. Of course, it means that you're retyping information and hard coding, which isn't good. But when it didn't work, it was because if we used both the name and the company fields in the label, the person's name was printed twice. This wasn't professional, but it was a standard tactic for anyone who didn't understand how to use expressions in Access, and we couldn't use expressions in tables. What we can do with these calculated fields is write in the table, which eliminates some of the issues people had by going through different options, such as using a combination of company name, last name, and first name with whatever information they have to make sure that they have some type of entry for use on things like mailing labels. That's just an example. By using calculated fields this way, it actually resolved some of the issues that I had with putting them in a table to begin with. The original problem with having calculated fields was not that they were calculated, it's that they should have been calculated. In other words, if I had a field for quantity and a field for cost, and then I wanted to know the total value of my inventory, I might put in a quantity of 10, a value of $5, and then I would manually type in $50. The problem was that when I changed the quantity or the cost, I also had to remember to update the total value. With calculations like this, we won't run into that issue because we're not typing anything into the field itself. We're letting Access do the calculations. So now that I get a chance to think about this, I'm not opposed to it as I initially thought. In fact, I think most people will like it. It certainly brings in a lot of people who normally would not have known how to create this type of thing in a query or a formal report. So, for the ease of Access use, and even as far as normalization goes, I think we'll be okay. We're basically moving the calculation fields from the queries or the forms and reports into the table instead, where then they can be used for any one of those other types of objects. So pretend for just a few moments that I've really gone in and customized this. I've renamed all of the fields. I have all the properties the way that I want, and now I want to save it. However, I know that I want to recreate this table because it's something I use very often. Well, normally I could copy and paste the table itself, but in Tooth I can actually continue to use these application parts in order to do the same thing. You basically want to strip what you don't need out of the database file and leave only what you want. In this case, if all I wanted to save was the table, I'd do whatever was needed to finalize the design of the table and then remove all of the other database objects from the file. I can save what's left as my template for use. That's the new part. I'll save my table by right-clicking the tab, and then I'll close it as well. And don't forget that normally I would have stripped out all of this other content, but right now we're interested in the process, so I won't take your time showing you how to delete objects. The next thing I have to do is move to File, and from my Backstage view I'll come down to Share, which will be Save and Publish in the final version. And from this option I'll move over to Save Database As. And you can see several things here: a regular database and a database in the 2000 format. Some advanced things like packaging and signing. You can even back up your database. But what I'm interested in is here on the right, called Saving It as a Template. I'll double-click that, and it will give me several options. You haven't seen many of these unless you've actually done application development. Things like a name, a description. I can put in a category. I can even give an icon to display and a preview. We won't work through all of this. I'll just give this a simple name, Student Table. Normally I would want to fill in the rest of that, but I can also choose a category to put it in. I will leave it at the default, which is User Templates. The important part for what I'm doing is to move down to the bottom of the dialog box and click this check mark that says Save it as an application part. I can also choose whether I want to include the data. The default is not to include the data, so none of the little work that I've done with my sample student names will be in there. So really, I gave it a name. I clicked Application Part. Now I'll click OK. It'll take a few seconds to process and save it as a template. Then it will come up and tell me that has successfully been saved, and it tells me where it's been saved as well. Notice that this is part of the templates folder, so all that's okay. It will be easy to find. I'll say OK from here, and now that I closed everything down, you might ask where you'll find it. Well, I'll go to the Create tab, come back to Application Parts, expand the gallery so you can see it, and below Quick Start, you can now see an option for User Templates, and this is where I can actually see the student table that I just created. I haven't had much time to work with this feature yet, but I think I'll begin to like it once I get used to it. I can certainly see the use for people who are not familiar with Access, and even those of us who are used to using Access will find a lot of uses to help us save some time.